Hey everyone, and welcome to an RU548 conversation with international mega literacy star, the book whisperer herself, living legend Donalyn Miller. Yay, Donalyn, thank you so much for joining us. I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, but can I introduce you first in terms of how I know you? Okay. So I was a middle school librarian in Wilmington, North Carolina, when we had scheduled a scholastic book fair. I'm guessing some of you in this room have held those in your libraries as well. On that book fair was this book I'd never seen before, but I had some scholastic dollars and I picked it up. It was called The Book Whisperer by Donalyn Miller. And it literally, I don't say this lightly, I don't say this flippantly, that book changed my professional and personal life. It completely helped me eradicate a culture of reading assessment in my school. It changed the way teachers in my building looked at readers as opposed to just reading. And the later that year, I got to meet Donalyn Miller at a conference in my state, and the rest is history. But she is a leader, not just in literacy, but in advocating for readers. And I'll let her tell you a little bit more about her professional and personal life. Let me turn it over to you, Donalyn. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Jennifer, thank you for inviting me to talk to some of our colleagues today. I really appreciate all of you. I mean, it is a Monday in COVID times, so it speaks highly of all of you that you're even upright and in front of a screen. So my plan is not to waste your time today. And that was my Apple charger falling on the floor. We could have a whole side conversation on why Apple needs to make their chargers so large, but I am a Texas educator. If my accent doesn't make that clear, it will pretty soon. I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, so that's the northeast corner of our state, about 90 miles from the Oklahoma border. I taught upper elementary language arts and social studies and middle school language arts and social studies for 15 years. And then I left that job to become an ambassador for Scholastic, and I was a Scholastic ambassador for 5 years. I traveled all around the world for Scholastic, visited schools in Japan and schools in Australia and many schools in Canada, and learned from great teachers and librarians there. I now work for myself as a consultant, which in 2020 is very interesting. It's a little hard to be a consultant who works in schools when all your school partners are closed. But I am writing a lot, and I'm also I feel like I'm getting some good opportunities to talk to colleagues on the telephone and in Zoom chats in an intimate way that I wouldn't have the time to do if I was still traveling 100 days a year. So I'm right now working on a book on reading joy. And so writing about joy is something we could talk about, Jennifer. It's a little challenging to write about joy right now, but having that work in front of me and to think about kids, really focusing on kids and teachers and librarians and school communities and what fosters reading joy with kids is helpful, because there will be an after all of this is over. We don't really know what it will look like, but we will still have schools. We will still have kids. We will still have a need for libraries. And so I just keep looking at that. How is what we're learning right now going to inform our understanding of teaching, our understanding of readers as we go into the future? I'm co-writing that book with Dr. Terry Lassane, and some of you might know Dr. Lassane if you're following librarians online. Dr. Lassane is a professor in the Library Sciences Department at Sam Houston State University down near Houston. It's one of the largest library science programs in our state. And Terry's been there about 25 years. She wrote an older book called Making the Match, which a lot of librarians know, especially secondary librarians, about the need to match kids with books. She has another book titled Reading Ladders, which Jennifer and I still refer to on a regular basis. But that book, Heinemann is publishing, and it should be out next year. And then I have another project going on with my friend Colby Sharp. He and I co-wrote Game Changer, Book Access for All Kids together. And Colby and I want to write a common sense book on classroom libraries. In fact, that's the working title right now, a common sense book about classroom libraries. And of course, it's a little tricky to study libraries and classroom libraries right now because there are none. There are no schools open. There are no children to talk to. There are no librarians to talk to. So we'll see what that research process looks like in the fall. But right now, I'm just spending a lot of my time reading, writing, working on projects around the house. Now that most of my schools here have closed for the summer. And Jennifer, I don't know, you've got students from all over the country, so may very well have folks who are still working with their schools right now. So if
Yeah.
that's you, let us know because we want to do what we can to support you. And then some of you may just now be transitioning into some kind of summer, and whatever that looks like for you, I'd be interested in hearing about too.
We have a mixture of school and public library students who'll be serving the needs of readers in a variety of locations. When they graduate, some of them already have jobs in libraries. Some are looking forward to that transition to a library role. And we've started this semester by thinking about what's the magic combination of things in the universe and that are put in there by design that creates the opportunity for a significant moment in our reading life. They read your article on Nerdy Book Club and where you talked about touchstones, these touchstone books in our lives, and what is it that creates an opportunity for us to have that reading moment that helps define our reading identity. And one of the things that has bubbled up from their conversations around that is this joy, this joyful reading, as opposed to prescribed reading for school and all the elements that go into helping create reading joy. And so I wanted to start there with reading joy. Like, when you think about that, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be a joyful reader? And how can we as librarians create opportunities for that kind of reading experience with kids?
Well, the first thing we have to all admit as adults is that the only reason adults continue to read when they're no longer required to is because we find something joyful about it. Now, joyful doesn't just mean fun, and we have to be mindful of that because intellectual challenge can be joyful in certain contexts. The reading that we do that causes some kind of grand epiphany can, even though it's a big leap in our learning, could also be considered joyful. So I want to be careful that we don't mix fun into kind of this soup of fun of making pleasure reading seem frivolous, which I often feel from schools at times. Like anytime we talk about reading for fun, it somehow sits apart from the more academic, more rigorous types of reading that we do. So the bridge we could really build, and Jennifer, I have all the research if you want to share it with your students, and you probably have some too, but the key to students' reading achievement success, which frankly just means scores on standardized tests of reading, which we know motivate many people. The key to high achievement on those tests is reading widely, reading a lot of things, and reading in volume, reading a lot. We have to read a lot. We have to commit to a lot of reading, and we have to read widely. That's the key to it. Well, then underneath that, what's the key to reading widely and the key to reading in volume? It's engagement and joy. So they're not disparate goals. I firmly believe we can teach kids how to love reading and still have high reading achievement and not kill their love of reading in the process. I think we can have it all. We just have to have that mindset that engagement and joy are always going to be on the table when we're trying to increase passion and effort. And passion drives everything that we do. Uh, we talk about persistence, resilience, some of these other labels that we use at school, but engagement and joy are a part of it. Kids will only read as much as they're minimally required to if they don't have any skin in the game, if there's nothing that's personally meaningful to them. So when we look at this vision that we have of having a joyful reading community where we may also have expectations for reading progress, what are the keys? And that's what I've been studying quite a bit. Researching reading joy is really interesting. When we talk about joy these days, a lot of people think, well, oh, it's trendy. Marie Kondo and her stuff on, does this give us joy and throwing out everything in our homes? But I found some research that goes back to 1910 from a librarian named Mary Plummer, who wrote an essay about the 7 joys of reading for the Sewanee Review in 1910. And so conversations around reading joy and reading engagement have been going back at least 100 years in the literature that I can find. What we know, though, the factors that lead to reading joy are sticky. They're the same factors at school and at home. They just play out a little bit differently. So for all of our public librarian colleagues in the group, this does, when I say school community, I really mean the community, both inside and outside the school. The first thing is time. Do our students have and our children have time to read? And that's at school, time to read, and time to read at home. Um, Time to read could also be expanded to include time to go to the library on a regular basis. And this is something that I know as a I've taught secondary school, middle school, and elementary school, and the mindset at a school sometimes around that regular reading visit to the library with students is different sometimes in secondary. But I think it's just as important for our middle school and high schoolers to have regular time to go to the library because it's an access piece. So time to go to the library, time to read in class, time supported at home, and then time for read alouds. And the research on read alouds is ubiquitous. We don't age out of the benefits of read alouds. If we aged out of the benefits of read alouds, the audiobook market would not exist. It's currently one of the highest growing markets in publishing right now. I think the Pew Research Foundation does a study on readers every year, adult reading habits in the United States. And last year, I think it was 18% of American adults read at least one audiobook. Raise your hand in the chat if that's you. That's up from 14% last year, up from 10%. And so even our middle schoolers and high schoolers benefit from listening to fluent readers read out loud to them every single day. So that would be that time bucket in all the ways that I'm looking at time. It leads right into access. If you know my work at all, you probably likely see me as an advocate for choice in reading. That's usually, I'm one of the choice reading people. That's the group I get put into. But I've come to understand that there is no choice without access. Choice is a privilege that depends on access. I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books in my home, so I have lots to choose from. But for a child who may not have library card, may not have internet access at home, and who may own few books at home, choice is a shadow. We can send kids home with the expectation that they read every night, but if they don't own any books at home, choice from what? That access piece also, of course, affects children in the summer. The research on summer reading is pretty powerful, going back to Jimmy Kim's research on the summer slump and the summer slide, the research that came out of Harvard. Many children scored lower on standardized tests of reading in the fall than those same children score the previous spring. And it's because they're not reading enough over the summer. It's often an access issue. If you are working in a school right now, you have seen this right now happening with COVID. How many of our students lost their book access overnight when schools and public libraries had to close because they don't own books at home and they have limited access to the internet. And I'm sure you've been talking about this, Jennifer, with the course. So that access piece is the key to everything. What if our students have reading apathy, if they are disengaged with reading? I always advise teachers and librarians to look at access and time, because without time to read and without books to read, then where is motivation going to come from to read? Access has some nuances to it as well, because of course we're looking at the physical access piece. Do our children have physical access to reading material, both online and off, and the ability to access them freely? But access also means intellectual access. So how are we potentially using things like leveling systems as a limitation on children's choice, which limits their access? Access also means social and cultural access. So does the access that we offer in our libraries include as many voices, perspectives, cultures, and points of view as possible? Because if we are preemptively not providing that access, it's also a limitation for our students. So time and access. But I thought let's talk about those for a little bit, Jennifer, and then I have a couple of other things that go on that road. But I think the access piece is where librarians are really at the forefront, because school librarians may not have much influence on whether kids are reading in the classroom or not. And public librarians may have little influence on whether kids are getting time to read at home. Although you might presume that if a family came
Right.
into the public library, they also had the mindset that the children would need time to read those books.
Hmm.
Um, the logistical aspects of not having technology and kids not having access to the internet is something many librarians are focusing on. And then the need for more diverse representation in the books that we offer students is an access piece. So, um, anything students want to talk to around those topics from their own experiences, I would encourage. But
I love that I can ask you one question and 30 minutes later, then you take a breath.
it's
Because
only been 17, Jennifer, only
I
17.
know, but you just have so much to share around this stuff, and I just love it. I just love it. I want to say something really quickly about something that you said that I was thinking as you were talking, and then I would like you, if you don't mind, to talk a little bit about the ways that you can help make that access meaningful for kids, in that we can be leaders in sharing our reading lives and positive ways to share books outside of the ways that sometimes classrooms, teachers feel that they have to. But when we talk about access, one thing I want to plant in my students' head, and if you've taken me for 515 or you're taking 515 right now, you'll hear this as part of my conversation with Ken Shelton, is that librarians can unintentionally actually put barriers to access by creating policies that revolve around responsibility, but that actually disproportionately affect some members of their school population than others. Of course, I'm talking about circulation, I'm talking about library fines, I'm talking about all of those policies that we create to protect our collections, because we know that if all the books just disappear, then we don't have anything to serve anyone. But that very unintentionally, if we look at the data around who is affected by those, who can't check out multiple books because they've lost something, who can't check out books or take them home because they owe money, etc. If we look at that data and find almost always, in my experience, that certain types of kids are disproportionately affected by those policies, our brown and black children, our kids living in poverty,
Mhm.
etc. So as
Indigenous
librarians, when we
children. Yeah.
yes. So when we think about access, then certainly we don't create sections of the library that we only allow certain students to go to. At least I hope we don't. But sometimes our policies affect access in ways that are insidious, that we don't even realize are happening, unless we really take a good look at the outcomes of those policies, as opposed to how the policy's written, the input. The output is what we want to look at, is the outcomes of those policies. So for my students, whether you're in a public library or you're in a school library or an academic library, the way that we really critically examine access is by critically thinking about our policies and how they affect children. So I want to throw that out there. Donalyn, you certainly can add to that if you want to, but I also want to just talk about how we get kids the right book in the right hand at the right moment.
Well, there are some institutional instructional, some societal barriers to library use in the first place. That are just there, that librarians may have little control of. Transportation is an issue. So how hard is the library to get to on foot in the summer or by public transportation? These are obstacles that families are navigating in order to use the public library. And whether you're going to be a school librarian or a public librarian, public library use is where we're hoping our kids are going in the summer, because the school is closed. So it's mindful for us, even in a school setting, to be aware of what's actually going on in our public libraries in our communities, because just rounding kids up and having them all get a library card as part of your summer reading kickoff is not going to be enough if there are tangible obstacles that prevent kids from using the public library. We think we've checked a box. Oh, we got all our kids a public library card. They're good for the summer. But where the rubber meets the road, that may not be enough. Library fines, this is a national conversation that's been happening for a couple of years, and you may have felt that in your own communities. I can trace it back to the big conversation that's taking place right now. Really started with the New York Public Library System when they did an audit of their library fines and found out that 1 in 5, 20% of the children who actually had library cards to the New York Public Library System could not use their cards because they were blocked after owing $15 in fines. Now, $15, that's not a lost book. That's just late fees, because a lost book
Mm-hmm.
often costs more than $15 to replace. And what the director of the New York Public Library System, Anthony Marks, what he discovered was, of course, that was hurting the most needy children in the city of New York. It was disproportionately affecting the kids who couldn't afford to pay the fines, which meant the kids who probably had the least amount of book access at home. And he started talking about doing some sort of amnesty or fine forgiveness program. And of course, we can predict some voices came out of the woodwork to complain, and we know what those issues would be. Oh, library fines are teaching children responsibility, or we're going, someone complained, all of our taxpayer resources are going to be flowing into the streets. And Dr. Marks laughed. He goes, I wish we had that problem. I wish all of our books were flowing into the streets in the city of New York. But that is not the problem that we have. And he said, our most important taxpayer resource in the city of New York is our children. And so they announced an amnesty and zeroed out all the fines for people 19 or 18 years older, 18 old and younger. And they also did an assertive campaign to get more people to get library cards, because they realized their library fine program was a deterrent to people even applying for library cards. Now, since New York has done that, we have now seen Chicago public libraries do this. Minneapolis public libraries have done this. Dallas public libraries have done this. And as these larger urban library systems are doing it, I think we will see more suburban and rural systems reevaluate their fine programs too. In Chicago, in the weeks after they announced that Chicago Public Library was going fine free, hundreds of thousands of library books were returned to the
Mm-hmm.
Chicago Public Libraries. So the exact opposite of what people thought would happen. Books weren't flowing into the streets, they were all flowing back into the library again, because people had been holding on to books they didn't want to pay fines for. They didn't want to
Right.
pay $40 in fines for Charlotte's Web. So they just held on to the book and never went to the library again. So it actually did the opposite. Library fines affect children at school too. Sadly, I know some librarians that have to depend on library fines as part of their budget. So that's a systemic conversation. If there's no replacement cost in a librarian's budget for lost materials, then that's a systemic problem. That's not something a librarian by themselves can solve. Um, I've seen some schools do some things like have kids read down their fines or do some service in the library. And on the face of it, those sound like good ideas. But if we back up and look at some of those programs, okay, you come in and read down your fine. Well, what does that look like? Well, you have to get to school early or stay after school late, which may cause some challenges. You have to give up your recess, your lunch, your free period to come into the library. And we've now turned reading into a punishment. I don't think that fosters a strong relationship between the librarian and the kids either.
Right.
So I think we have a responsibility as a steward of a resource to do what we can to get that book back into the building. But I would rather lose a book than lose a child, and that is what the stakes are in some cases. So if you have the autonomy to waive fines, that does give you some autonomy. But I think there is also a system-wide discussion to be taking place around library fines. There's also things like, what are the residency requirements that your public library asks people to produce in order to get a library card? Think about my Title I school in Fort Worth where I taught. I might have two families living in the same duplex or living in the same apartment. They both don't have a gas bill to go down to the library to get a library card. And so just really, I think it takes partnering with families to determine what are the obstacles to library use. And then talking at a school district or even library department level around library fines. And that conversation is happening in national library systems. And so I think it will trickle down. It's just how can we be drivers of that?
Yeah,
Especially for our kids who are the neediest kids. The kids who can
I
afford to
know.
pay the fines are often not the kids who need the books the most.
And the thing is we don't have to necessarily be the holder of all the solutions, but
Nope.
what we can be is the person who looks critically at the actual policy, presents the problem that the policy creates, and then ask for help in figuring out what the solution is. Because most people, when you say, hey, this is a problem, our poorest kids are the ones who can't check out books, people will help you brainstorm some solutions to that. But so what I want to
Well,
do now, if
asking
it's
the question is helpful. I went to my
exactly.
public library was doing this fine forgiveness program around Thanksgiving every year. You bring in canned goods and you get your library fines waived. And I just asked the director of the library one day when I was there and she was out at the desk. I said, I think this is a great program, but what are you doing for the people that you're giving the canned goods to? And she said,
Right.
that's for the people who can afford the canned goods. And she told me, she goes, we didn't think about that. So sometimes you don't have to be the solution. You don't have to bring the solution, but the question
Yes.
to someone who is making decisions can be a driver.
Because sometimes people haven't thought about it. It doesn't mean they're bad people. They just hadn't thought
No.
about it.
Well,
Right.
yeah, this is why we need each
So
other.
why don't we take a few questions, and then if you wouldn't mind, Book Whisperer, after the questions, will you just share some books with us that you're
Yeah.
excited about in 2020? Okay, so first let's see, are there students, do you have any questions for Donalyn? And if you just want to unmute yourself, there's enough of us in the room, you know, there's not 100 of us in the room. If you unmute yourself and ask, that'll be great. So let's see who's got a question.
Oh, and I did want to say time and access are two, but choice and community are the other two. So time and access, I think if we don't have those two things in place, conversations around community and choice are more abstract, but we would put
Right.
them on the list too.
Excellent. All right, who has a question for Donalyn? Go ahead, Bernadette.
Hi, thanks for coming and speaking with us today. I was just wondering, what do you think public libraries can do to connect better with school libraries beyond, you know, just summer reading programs in developing lifelong readers?
I think some of it comes from our school partners, right? You know, I know a lot of public librarians who want to partner with schools. They don't always know how to get in. You know, who do they talk to? So this is where school librarians and school library directors can really be helpful, I think, in partnering with public libraries, because does a public librarian go to the district office? Does the public librarian connect with an individual campus? What if the school campus doesn't have a school librarian, sadly? Then the public librarian may not even see a way in. And so I do feel like our school librarians can really be helpful to public librarians to be the first hand out the door. And what are some, I would think all year long, the public library is going to have a broader collection of resources than even the school library does. Particularly nonfiction is probably going to be twice as large. The database access may be significantly larger. You're also looking at systems, services that you provide to whole families all year long beyond summer reading that school librarians may not even know about. One type of program that is useful that school librarians can't even access through the school district is adult literacy programs. Many families, if students are striving to reach the full potential of their literacy promise, they may often have caregivers who struggle with their literacy skills too. We don't have the ability to remediate an adult's literacy needs at a K-12 school setting, but there may be a partnership with a public library program that can help a whole family. So I think it's looking at public library, what are all the services you're providing to families? And how can you share and offer those with schools all year long? So do they have literacy events all year? Do they have a reading night or a writing night? Is that something that you could participate in that's not just the summer reading kickoff? Does the counselor have a list of the kinds of family services that you might provide to the library? And I mean, even things like income tax help, translators, internet service. Are you checking out hotspots? You know, what are some social supports that the library provides that people other than the librarian in the school building might need? I think that's just a few ideas, ma'am, but I also want to encourage all of you who are school librarians, reach out to your public librarians because they have resources that we don't even need. For example, I had a student, Caleb, in my class who came from Panama, and he was supposedly a fourth grader on paper, but testing him, he was reading at about a high first grade, second grade level. It was very difficult to find him books in Spanish that he was interested in reading that were also at his real reading level. You know, a fourth grader does not want to read books written for a first grader. Even emailing the other librarians in our district, I was only able to get together about 25 books for him at that time. But we were able to partner with our public librarian, and she was able to find us all sorts of resources, not just for him, but for other children. And sometimes we feel like if we can't solve the problem within the borders of the school district, we can't solve it. And we forget that we're sitting in the middle of a whole community of people who want to help. So when you reach those reading access challenges that you can't, device access, that's another way public libraries may be able to help navigate, or ways to get kids ebooks and audiobooks. Audiobooks are expensive. I can't afford to buy audiobooks for all my students who need them, but being able to use the public library database really helped a lot. So just, befriending librarians is always good advice. This is what I feel. So.
Can I add to that, Donalyn? Do you mind if I add something else?
No, go right ahead. You have another one too.
Every school district has people who work at the central office to support the various roles in the district. So you have somebody who is the support person over libraries at a school district. You have somebody who's the support person over PE, over guidance counselors, over nurses, over math teachers, over whatever. You have someone in those buildings, right? Those people have to provide and hold meetings for their constituents every month. And they are constantly looking for stuff to fill those meeting minutes. So if I'm a public librarian and I want to get in with the school system, I'm going to look at the school system webpage, find out who's over libraries, who's over English teachers, who's over social studies teachers, and I'm going to connect with them and say, hey, the next time you're holding a meeting, can I have 15 minutes to share the resources that we have? And that person is more than likely going to gratefully say, yes, you can have 15 minutes. Would you like 30? And that's kind of what they're going to do because they're looking to fill those minutes. I know that because I've been that person for a school system before and was constantly looking for things to fill my meeting minutes, constantly. But once you get there, then the next step, once you're in the door, is to say, hey, if you would like to hold professional development at the public library, I'll reserve the meeting room for you so you don't have to do any of that if you'll give me 10 minutes to share the resources I have related to what you're doing. So then once you get them into your building, then you can show off all of your wares. Sometimes you have to be subversive, like you have to take the back door in to get there. But once you're in there, people just don't even know that what you have is available. Like they don't know what you have available. But once you're there and are able to share, I find that educators are so eager and hungry for resources that they will come back. So you have to sometimes just be creative about getting in the door and then getting them into your door. But I think Donalyn, that's great advice. And thank you for letting me add to it. I appreciate it.
Counselors, don't forget our counseling department.
Yes.
Social and emotional learning is a big topic of conversation among the counselors. A trauma-informed education, how are we meeting the needs of families, and then what social supports can be provided through the community library that families might need that schools can't provide. So,
right, excellent. Okay, other questions? Anybody else?
Catherine says she has a question. I also have a question.
Yes,
okay,
I do have a question for you. I just want to say thank you so much for meeting with us because I am a huge fan. I've done the 40 book challenge with my classroom for a few years now, and it's completely changed how I read with my kids and how I give them that time. And I teach 5th grade right now in a very poor, diverse neighborhood where they don't have access to books. And I know you were mentioning your book on classroom libraries. And so I was just wondering what recommendations you have for classroom libraries and how to maximize and make that most effective.
I think the first thing we have to do as librarian and teacher colleagues is we have to recognize that it's not a competition between school libraries and classroom libraries. I even had someone get upset with me over the term classroom library because they said without the term, if there's no librarian, there's no library. You know, I don't think, I'm like, well, you know what, call my home library a library, and no librarian lives with me, but okay. I mean, I think arguments around those terminologies are not productive. Classroom library is more about proximity to the children. And that means that the origin of the books doesn't matter so much. It's proximity to the children. So I encourage teachers to partner with librarians to check out rotating collections and bring them down to the classroom. It adds the diversity of the books that are available for kids. It also reinforces the relationship between the school library and the classroom teachers. For classroom teachers, I think we have to free ourselves from having to own every single book in the classroom library. It really needs to be built in response to the children's needs that we have in front of us. So interest surveys are extremely helpful. They were always helpful to me as a teacher, not just reading interest surveys, because if you're working with students who may not have a lot of enthusiasm for reading, the minute you start asking them what books they like, they may not have very many titles to list. And so I often, especially with my middle schoolers and high schoolers, I want to know, what are their responsibilities outside of school? What are their interests? What do they dream about doing? How can I get some books into it also helps me understand, oh, well, some of them have jobs. Some of them are babysitting little siblings after school. That may cut into their reading time at home. But I'm also looking for any kind of interest I can leverage that could result in adding books to the collection or highlighting books specific to the students. Series, there's no reason to have all 15 books in a series in a classroom. But what I will often do, and librarians I recommend this too, have more than one copy of book one in a popular series in the collection, because let's say it's a little hard to move into the rest of the Hunger Games without having read the Hunger Games. And so if your copy of the Hunger Games is always checked out, the rest of that series is dead in the water. We don't have to have every single award winner in our classroom libraries either. If we build the classroom library with the understanding that we are always going to be partnering with the school library to do it, and that the school library and the school librarian are always going to have resources that we don't have. It's more about, how can that classroom library support my curriculum? How does it support my students that I have on any given year? How can I focus? Nonfiction is always going to be bigger in the school library, and it should be. How can I use this classroom library as a way of continuously providing books to kids with the understanding that in a reading culture, strong reading culture, you can't send kids to the library as much as they want to go. And that you're almost training wheels for them to use the school library, because they can do that with lower risk. Oh, Jennifer.
Oh, there's Don Miller.
Exciting of you today.
Well, listen, Donalyn, let me add to that as well. Every time you say something, I'm going to add something to it, because I'm going to tell a secret. I'm going to pretend like we're going to activate the what happens in RU548. Hey, Don Miller, what happens in 548 stays in 548, right? So that's what this is, the shroud of secrecy here. I'm going to tell a secret Donalyn doesn't know I'm going to tell right now, so I hope it's okay. It doesn't end our friendship. But when you were writing Game Changer with Colby Sharp, remember, I wrote a whole section on classroom libraries and school libraries. And in it, I included a quote from my principal that Scholastic would not allow us to put in there, remember?
Yes,
okay,
yes.
So that's the secret. My principal, when we went to a program, we had an initiative in my district to start beefing up classroom libraries. My principal, I'll never forget, in the school library with the English teacher said, I want your classroom library to be the gateway drug to this room here, the school library. I want your classroom library to make kids hungry for more reading, so they have to come down to the library. That's what I want. Scholastic would not let us put gateway drug in there, remember, Donalyn? Like, we had to, so if you all
we had to have a
Game
meeting,
Changer,
if I remember correctly.
Yes. Okay.
You and I had to have a meeting about that term because they were very worked up about it. It's not in the book either. So
it isn't. It didn't make
but,
it.
But I think that's right. You know, I think about the school library is intimidating. If you are not an engaged reader and your teacher just flings you into the library, you may not have had a positive relationship yet with a school librarian. It can be very intimidating to be in that space and just be told to go get a book. We think that our middle schoolers and high schoolers know how to find a book in the library. They don't. And they need some scaffolding and support still. So classroom library is a great way to provide that scaffolding and support. I know as a teacher, dipping in and out of that classroom library all day long for kids, but there was also a lot of kids going to the school library too. It's also, I think it's helpful to the school librarian. And Jennifer, you and I talked about this before, because a couple of studies that I've seen have shown that in schools that have strong classroom libraries, circulation in the school library increases.
It goes up. Yes.
Because
yes.
there's more kids in the school actively reading and more engaged as readers. Now, I used to keep a list of books that were hot books in my classroom library, and I would go down and talk to my friend Kim, the librarian, and tell her, hey, this book is really catching on. I only taught 120 kids in the school, about 10% of the kids that went there, but that's 10% of the kids that wanted that book, and I bet it might be popular to other kids too. Librarians who often have reduced budgets now, they want to buy books that will circulate. And so teachers having that feedback loop with librarians can really help. So I think
we have a
answered
couple.
that question.
No such thing. I mean, folks can, duck out if they need to, but I want us to
go
keep
after
talking.
Anne.
Yes, I want to give Anne the opportunity to ask her question. So go ahead, Anne.
Hi, I want to say thank you again for coming, but also I want to circle back to the conversation that we were having after Bernadette's question about the supervisors, because so in my last school, I had a supervisor who was not a librarian. He was technology and math and had no idea what to do with libraries. And every time there was a school meeting, he wouldn't actually set anything up for us. And we ended up going, instead of meeting with the librarians in the district, we ended up being stuck going to the school meetings and sit through what the teachers were going through, which half the time had nothing to do with what we actually needed. So like, what would you do in a situation like that?
How willing would that supervisor be to other ways of running the meetings?
He was not very willing to a lot of things. Unfortunately, it became a whole problem, and it did end up, so that school district had librarians and computer teachers, and in the end, they were between reducing the number of librarians in the elementary schools or the computer teachers. In the end, they reduced the number of computer teachers. So instead of 4 computer teachers for the 4 elementary schools, there were only 2 computer teachers. And the librarians had to cover, and then also the 2 computer teachers had to go between schools instead of being in one. So it ended up being this whole debacle, but we never really had the chance to talk about it. It just happened.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to woulda, shoulda on conversations you should have had, because I wasn't there. And it's also the context of your teaching situation. So I have to respect that. But there's some opportunity to do some PLCs and have that suggested and say, hey, all of us are in different stages of our careers. We have different interests. We feel like we'd be stronger together if we could differentiate some of our own professional learning around librarianship. And then maybe there are some articles, webinars, books, or some other things that as librarians you could get together and use that meeting time to at least have your PLC, because then at least it would be something productive and individualized to your needs as librarians. And if you would be willing to come up, like, you're not asking the supervisor to do anything then either. Like you're saying, we'll get together, we'll make a list, maybe a Google spreadsheet that just has a running list of things people might be interested in doing. You could even make a Google survey and just collect data from all the librarians on what they would be interested in learning about. And then it's self-directed PD, which in my mind is the best PD anyway. I think all of us would be happy if we had fewer meetings in our lives. And you could differentiate for it, and your supervisor wouldn't be responsible for planning or really doing anything. I don't know, Jennifer, if you have.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right advice. I want to add to it with an example from my friend Melissa Lim, who is an educator. She's a tech educator in Portland. She goes by the Instagram handle Action Hero, and she's amazing. So she's someone to follow. If you're in 515 and you're doing your PLN project, I'm adding a follow for you on Instagram if you're doing Instagram. But she, because in her school district, there wasn't PD available for the technology educators. They only had technical people at central office who knew how to run the network, but didn't know anything about how teaching kids how to use use technology, right? So she started her own after school. It was actually on a weekend. It was a monthly optional meeting that she called Teachers in Coffee Shops Having Coffee, after the Jerry Seinfeld, comedians in cars having coffee, right? So she called it Teachers in Coffee Shops Having Coffee. And it started with just a handful of these tech educators who would get together on a Saturday at a local coffee shop and have coffee, but it eventually grew. And then she had the genius idea to invite some of the central office leadership to join them at their coffee shop. And here's what happened. They were like, boy, do we have anything like this going on in the school district where you all get to meet and talk about pedagogy around technology? And they were like, no, that's why we're doing this. And so then they created the opportunity. So to add to what Donalyn was saying is that
probably ruined it. Can we just say that? They probably ruined it the minute they took it over. But at least
well, they still have teachers in coffee shops having coffee. That continues to happen. They still have that, but now they also have support at the district level. So just to add to what Donalyn was saying is that once you all build something, then you can invite that person to the table to show them, send the message that you all care about curriculum and student learning, and that you all are working on this even without the support of somebody. So if you build it, they won't necessarily come, but you can keep inviting them. And I think that sends an important message. So I hope that answers. So, and then Molly, you have a question, go for it.
Okay, hi. So we read your article Touchstones for this class, and we also did a reading autobiography project, which I really enjoyed. And I thought it would be really fun to do at different stages in your life and be able to look back on and see how it changes. And I was wondering if you had ever led a project like that with young people, and if so, how it went.
So I have done reading autobiography projects with middle schoolers. And in fact, I'm writing about reading autobiographies right now for the Joy book that I'm writing on. And what I have found is reading autobiographies as an activity do really well with educators and librarians, because we have 30 years of reading experiences to go over. I think it's very risky for kids, particularly at the beginning of a school year where they don't have trust, they may not have many reading experiences, and they may not be, and the reading experiences they do have may be absent or negative, because there's a way to orchestrate that project where it can come off as making a list of favorites. And that's not what it is. I mean, we understand it's books that were influential. Even if they were books we didn't necessarily enjoy, we can still go back and see that. It's harder for 12-year-olds to do that. It's harder for 15-year-olds to do that. I think at the beginning of the year, investing in those relationships matters more. And then us making a commitment to ensure, no matter what their reading autobiographies look like before they came in the door, I want to ensure they have some positive reading experiences this year. I've found more, because when I've done this with my middle schoolers, I think we have to be prepared. A lot of what they share is negative. And I think sometimes teachers think it's going to be reminiscing over books that we've loved, but then you get 7th graders and 8th graders who talk about how they haven't read a book in 4 years. And that's hard at the beginning of the year for a teacher to know what to do with when they don't have many relationships with the kids. Reading autobiographies work a lot better with students as an end of year activity, as a reflection, or even a mid-year reflection. It's a nice way to celebrate the reading that they've done all year. It's also a nice way for them to kind of commit to reading in the future, which is something we want to hand off to them. And then, of course, you were there as a witness to many of those reading experiences, and you can help kids see the positive even in that, because what we're really focusing on is what did they learn about themselves as a human being or as a reader, or how did it shape them? And even books they abandoned can still teach us a lesson about ourselves as a reader. So I don't know, I've tried it both ways. Honestly, it works really well for adults because it reminds us all that we have had some negative reading experiences in our lives or gaps. And I think that helps teachers inform their work with students. But for students, I would wait till the end of the year.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right,
Jennifer?
Donalyn. Yeah, go ahead.
Do I have time to share a book before people go?
This is what I was going to ask you to do.
Okay.
Can you share some great books with us that you love right now before you go?
I know Miss Lagarde has given you a lot of books that you're assigned to read right now. So I thought I would pick 2 books that are short that you might want to slip into your list somehow. And then Jennifer, the book club that Jennifer and I are in is reading Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. And I think it's on your syllabus, isn't it, Jennifer?
It is.
This one too. And of course, Elizabeth Acevedo, I would read anything that she writes. National Book Award winner. But here's 2 YA books that are shorter. The first one is Kent State, and it is written by Deborah Wiles. We've just this year in May was the 50th anniversary of the shooting at Kent State. Well, is it 50th? I think so. It's very close. Anyway, it happened in the 70s. Anniversary of the Kent State massacre. In light of our current culture and current events, looking at National Guardsmen who just opened fire on a bunch of college students is sadly prescient, sadly ripped from the headlines. But it goes into, I'll tell you, I learned a lot as an adult about the days leading up to the Kent State massacre. We all know what happened, that students were shot, but it was an escalating event that went on for several days. Deborah Wiles is a crack researcher. She also has written this as a novel in verse from multiple perspectives. So you have the voices of the townspeople, the voices of the politicians, the voices of the students, the voices of Black students in that community. And so when I first started reading the book, it was a little confusing to figure out all those voices, but I think she wanted it to be like that. I think she wrote it so that we would have all those voices coming at us at once. And it was good. And it took me an afternoon to read it, not even that long. The other one I want to recommend is Say Her Name, which is by Zetta Elliott. This is a collection of poems, and it is written about the Black women who have been shot by police officers, not just the Black men. And it looks at moms, Black mothers, Black girls, and some of the things that they have had to face in their lives. And so I just felt like it's part of the conversation around social justice and activism written through the perspective of Black women. And so I feel like any list we have that's looking at social justice and civil rights should include it. It's got poems by Lucille Clifton in here, Nikki Giovanni, just some master poets that you probably recognize and that you're probably already reading with kids in some middle school and high school English classes. But those are the ones that I have, Jennifer. I know you gave them a long list of assigned reading, so I didn't want to add to the pile.
That's okay. They know they can substitute. They can substitute assigned ones for their choices if they want to. So that's great. Thank you so much, my friend, for doing this. If my students want to follow you on social media and continue to learn from you, where can they find you?
So my Twitter ID is Donalyn Books, and check your spelling of Donalyn because it has 2 N's, but they're apart. They're not Donna and Lynn. I'm Donalyn M on Instagram, and then I have my Book Whisperer Facebook page.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, friend. I really appreciate it. Yay. I'm going to stop the